Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Nick Amis, and it's great that you're able to join us for today's Cinnamon Connect webinar. Each week, we look at current issues facing churches and Christian charities and offer practical advice and encouragement on how to respond. Well, since last week's joke about my lockdown hair, I decided to let my wife cut mine. It was her first attempt at ever cutting hair. And what's most disconcerting is that she was laughing all the way through whilst not letting me look at what she was doing. Well, thankfully, I have survived without resorting to the clippers and the G.I. Joe cut. So that's one thing out of the way. Today, we're going to be discussing a particularly difficult subject, and that is of bereavement and loss due to coronavirus. We'll be looking at the impact on individuals and families, how churches are adapting under the current circumstances, and how you can get involved in supporting those who are suffering. If I just take you through a couple of the practicalities. So you may have noticed that obviously your microphones are muted. If you could keep them muted for the time being, what we'll do is give you the opportunity, if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Please pop those in the chat box on the side. And what we'll do is we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the call, and we'll be able to go through some of those questions and comments. You're welcome to have your videos on if you wish. We did default them to off, but that's entirely up to you. I hope you really enjoyed the call today, and I'll pray for everybody. Heavenly Father, I just want to ask that you be with us right now as we talk about this difficult subject. I'm just conscious that not only are there many people out there suffering, but there may be people on the call today who are themselves feeling the pain of loss of loved ones. So we just pray for, would you give us sensitivity today? Will you give wisdom and support to everyone who's here today? We just commit this time to you in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Well, today, let me start by talking a little bit about what's currently happening. And you may well be familiar. I'm sure you've been keeping abreast of the news. But the latest figures report that 26,097 people have so far died due to coronavirus. With an average of 5 people grieving the loss of a loved one, that means that over 130,000 people today are suffering the agony of bereavement. And many of us will no doubt know someone who has died or friends who have lost someone. We've actually had somebody within our church lose their son due to coronavirus, and it's been a very difficult time. Their families are struggling to come to terms with the circumstances of the loss, with the usual process for grieving having been completely disrupted. And of course, people continue to die for other reasons too. And with social distancing restrictions in place and limitations on how funerals can be conducted, those who are bereaved are facing additional stress and anxiety. But beyond death, many of us are coming to terms with other losses in our lives. Up to 2 million workers so far have lost their jobs due to the lockdown. And a report by the Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex anticipates that around 6.5 million people in total could find themselves without work as a result of the crisis. Beyond this, others are grieving the loss of stability, security, and the usual social structures that we all rely on. The emotional and psychological strain of all this is akin to bereavement. And in light of these vast and complex needs, how can we, the church, respond with kindness and compassion without burning ourselves out in the process? It's my pleasure to welcome our guest speakers, Reverend Sharon Townsend and Reverend Canon Yvonne Richmond Tulloch. Sharon is the senior pastor of Junction Community Church in South London. She's a qualified psychodynamic counsellor, that's easy for you to say, with over 20 years experience of counselling, addressing a wide range of issues. In her current job role as NHS mental health chaplain, Sharon also provides spiritual and pastoral care. She is passionate about the community and believes that improving the mental health and well-being of individuals is key to a strong community. Sharon is also the co-founder of Living Loss, an organisation that raises the awareness of the grief experience during the natural course of life and helps churches to set up loss and bereavement groups. And Yvonne, was a cathedral canon when she was suddenly widowed in 2008. She used her experience to help others access support, and in 2016 she founded AtALoss.org. She is now Bishop's Officer for Clergy Bereavement for Southwark Diocese and helps care for the family as chaplain for their widowed young support, as well as that she's a facilitator for their bereavement care awareness days. She is the author of Faith Questions in Bereavement and leads HTB's The Bereavement Journey course. Well, welcome to you both. It's great that you can be with us today. I hope you're both well.
Really good to see everybody and to be here.
Great. And welcome to you, Sharon. So we'll hear from both of you in a moment, but before we do that, welcome to everybody. I'd like to start by doing our first poll of the day. As you've been on our calls before, you're probably familiar with these by now. But the first question we have for everybody on the call is this, have you seen an increase in demand for emotional support? So whether that's within your congregation or whether that's coming from other areas, have you experienced an increase in demand for emotional support? So in a moment, you should see that question come up on the screen. And if you could just tell us what you're currently experiencing and submit your answers, and then we'll see how everybody is doing. Okay, how are we doing, David? Are we almost there? Okay. Yeah, so about 50% seeing an increase, with about another 40% seeing quite a significant increase. So that's yeah, that's very interesting and probably not unexpected. Yvonne, if I could come to you first, could you tell us a little bit about your story and what you've been doing, please?
It's good to be here, everybody, and to see you all. At least some of you on my screen. It's really great to be part of all of this. And thanks for inviting me, Nick. I've been working with bereaved people. I know this call is about bereavement very generally, but I've been involved in working with bereaved people who have suffered the death of somebody. So our work is supporting bereavement by death. And just to sort of, as I begin, just to pick up on what you said there, Nick. The problem is much bigger than this COVID-19 crisis. We're all acutely aware of the difficulties at the moment because of lockdown and the TV and radio constantly talking about the number of people who are dying. But before this happened, there was a big problem anyway. And that's what I've been involved in dealing with or working with. As you said, my story began in 2008. When I was a cathedral canon. My husband died very suddenly of a heart attack. And as a minister, I realized then the lack of understanding that there is for those who are bereaved anyway. Both in the church and in society. And it became very aware to me and talking to other people that there's this sort of death denial thing that had been going on for quite some while. And people's lack of understanding over the grief journey and the significance of loss and the impact of loss can often make matters worse, and people can feel very isolated. And that's not just, that's the church as well as society. And this was, I realized I had for myself, I lacked understanding, and I realized there was a problem. And this isolation can go on a long time. Grief journey is a very long journey, and often one finds that the support is around the time of the death, but actually the pain is something that kicks in usually a lot later, and that's when people drop away and so on. So I decided I needed to do something about this problem, and set up a charity in 2016 called AtALoss.org, designed to signpost the bereaved to support services, because nobody was really signposting, not even the professionals, when people suffer a loss. A signposting website that would just help the bereaved easily to find the support services that do exist. We also plugged gaps that were around at the time, training youth workers in young people's, supporting young people through loss, peer support for bereaved men and young adults. But I wanted all along to help the churches to understand bereavement that much more, and the impact of grief, and to help them to be able to support those who were grieving. And this problem over the years since I began on this journey with it all has increased, and the number of deaths have been rising. We've got 600,000 deaths every year anyway, and you sort of mentioned an average of 5 people who are grieving. Well, that's a low figure. Usually a lot more than that are deeply impacted by somebody's grief. So with 600,000 every year, and maybe 10 or even 20 close family and friends really impacted by this, that's a huge number of people anyway, before we had COVID-19. So the numbers were rising because we've got, because of the demographic with our population and everything, baby boomers reaching later age, numbers are rising anyway, and the problem is getting worse. It's also getting worse because people have begun to realise now about grief, the importance of grieving, and there's a lot of unprocessed grief in our society anyway, because people have put grief on hold because of not being supported and not being understood. So the charities were finding a big problem, the bereavement charities were finding a big problem anyway with not having capacity, and counsellors being oversubscribed, and people not getting the support that they need. So the churches getting involved in this was so important. So and also because churches are a natural place for people anyway, being in communities, involved in many deaths, people searching for meaning when they're bereaved. So churches getting involved in supporting bereaved was really important. So I began to talk to other Christian charities about how we could help churches to support the bereaved. Worked with Care for the Family in, as you mentioned, chaplain for widowed young support, bereavement care awareness, training, and the HTB bereavement journey. So it got alongside those initiatives to try to bring those resources together and form some sort of complementary package that could be offered to churches generally, so that they could get alongside the bereaved and offer friendship support to take some of the pressure off the professionals and the charities. And we were beginning to do that anyway when this COVID-19 problem struck. So we launched an initiative called Loss and Hope, designed especially to equip churches to support the bereaved. And we launched that on the 5th of March, literally just before all of this began, the very first day that the first death of COVID-19 happened in the UK. So as far as I'm concerned, that's God's amazing timing of putting us out there at a time when there was going to be this so much need. And since the 5th of March, our charity, our signposting website, AtALoss.org, has been picked up on widely across the UK. It's now on the website, it's now being recommended by the government, the NHS, Care England. It's about to go on posters across the London Underground. So basically, we as a Christian charity have provided something which the country is calling for and asking for. And there's a one-stop place where the bereaved can actually find support services. And my heart has always been that the church would be able to provide services and would be on that signposting website. So that's kind of where we're at, and hoping that churches will be able to do things that can be on there and the bereaved can find them.
Well, thank you for that. That's really, really helpful to put that in context, and yeah, really good. Sharon, I'd like to come to you next. Just widening in that conversation, something that Yvonne had mentioned there about the fact that it's wider than just about the loss of a loved one, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what you're involved in, and pick up on that subject.
Okay, thank you, Nick, and morning to you all. Yes, Living Loss. We started off running a bereavement group, and through the bereavement group, we were finding that a lot of people were presenting other losses, such as losses in divorce, relationship, health, dementia, loss of home, families that have moved out to another country, people that have never met their siblings, and that's how it came about that we could. It was similar to someone losing someone through death. Grief was presenting itself through those areas of loss. So we've been working with that within the groups, and finding that people were expressing similar feelings as if someone had passed away. We've been running this group for now 8 years, and every time we run a loss and bereavement group, we now call it Living Loss, it's because people are coming to these groups because of these other losses, rather than someone that has passed away. And it has helped. It has helped people to understand and explore what's their feelings, their emotions, and able to step up and really look at life differently, and realizing that probably they're not really going mad in a sense, but they're understanding their emotions, that it does relate to grief.
What would you say? What are the effects? What does it look like for someone who's grieving that way? It may be obvious, I suppose, if a family member's died, and generally people would know that it's pretty obvious what someone's going through. But what's happening with someone maybe who's grieving from something in the past, or something kind of less obvious? How do you recognize that someone's suffering in that particular way?
It could be in their behavior, in how they react to people or talk to people. It could be conversations that they may have with someone. For example, they may talk about how they don't know why they're feeling low or depressed, or they can't move on or move forward, and not thinking that it could be something that have happened in their life or in their past. And when we actually explore that, and realizing it's the loss of probably family member moving out, or they've never had a proper relationship with their parents, or the relationship have broken down, and don't realize that's the reason why it caused you to react the way you do or behave the way you do.
And I guess in these difficult times when people are out of the normal routine and maybe likely on their own, that actually it's a time for old memories to resurface, things from the past that they may not have dealt with, that are now a real challenge for people that on their own.
Yeah, because there's a lot of triggers that happen when people are on their own, or thinking about things, internalizing things. And sometimes they just need help to help them through that. And Living Loss provides that space for people to able to find coping mechanism to deal with those triggers that come about in their lives.
Yeah. Everybody, would you like to come back to you and to ask another polling question, which is, what have you put in place to support people during this crisis? So have you already been put in place pastoral care structures, telephone support? Maybe you've done buddying systems to look after people. So bring up that question for us, please, David. And if you let us know what kind of things you as a church have already been doing. Be fascinating to find out. Do please continue to post your questions and comments in the chat box. So we will come back onto those. We're going to have a quick Q&A time at the end, an opportunity to ask our speakers some questions. Great. How are we doing, David? How's it looking?
It only seems to allow one option at the moment.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, we've set that up slightly incorrectly. That should have been set up as a multi-choice question. It's set up as a single choice question. So apologies for that. But if you could tick the main one that you've been doing and submit that one, that would be great. Okay, have we got the results for us, please, David? Okay, so that's interesting that there's a lot of telephone support been set up for people, which I suppose is not unsurprising in that we're left with little else in terms of ways to support people. Great, thank you for that. So Sharon, come back to you if I may. What are the ways in which we can help people deal with their grief whilst we're in this situation of social isolation and lockdown? What practical things can we do?
One or two things that have been mentioned with this telephone supporting, but in the lockdown, it really is important if you can find someone that you could talk to over the phone. If you could go speak to one of your leaders, where one of your leaders could probably refer someone to a counsellor, where they can have the option to talk to a counsellor over the phone. And it's interesting because I was speaking to a gentleman the other day, an elderly person who was on his own. He was really lonely, and he was internalizing all sorts of things, and just thinking on negative things. And I tried to get him to think about the positive and what things were good, you know, to help him to think on good things and positive things to help him through, to get through each day. But I know there's some people that probably are not able to do that. And if they're not, then it's really important to pick up the phone, speak to someone. And if that person can't help, then I'm hoping that that person will be able to refer that person to someone else that can help them. But it is important if they could speak to someone if we're through this lockdown.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, that's just, yeah, so important, isn't it? Even it's just about sharing memories and, you know, talking about what's happening with them, how they're feeling, and so on. Yeah. And Yvonne,
some positive stuff.
Yeah, Yvonne, if I could come back to you, I know that you mentioned a few things that you're involved in, and how those things can be now used to help people.
Yes, thank you. We, as I mentioned before, we were planning a range of resources for churches to help them get alongside the bereaved. And now that we've got the lockdown situation, we've been trying to create those online as best we can and see what we can do over the summer to help churches support this particular situation. So the first thing that we've done is we've created a short film that's on YouTube for sharing around anywhere to anybody, saying if you know someone who's been bereaved, these are the things that you can do to help them whilst they're in lockdown. And it's basically, it's just 3.5 minutes, it's very brief. It just sort of, you know, contact, listen to them and bless them. And some practical tips about getting in touch, daring to get in touch, talking to them, asking about the person and the loss, and helping them to drawing out of them their story, helping them to talk, and blessing them with nice things. You know, we can all do that even in lockdown. So that's one thing. We've got this little film that can be shared, just about little things that you can do to make a difference. And then the other thing that we've been trying to do is we're trying to get the bereavement journey available online across the UK. Now I run this course for HEB Holy Trinity Brompton. It's been around for 23 years. About 4 years ago it was filmed, and we've published it just recently so that it can be available by churches to provide self-help groups. If this is face-to-face, it's designed for face-to-face groups. A bit like the Alpha course, whatever, there's a film you discuss, there's a film you discuss. And so the material's all there. It makes it easy for churches to do, to to just get people together to talk about the issues and the impact of their loss. And it's proven to be extremely helpful for any type of bereavement. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make that now an online course as best possible over the summer. We're trialing it with HTB next week, and with a coalition of loss and hope that was launched in March. We're together trying to encourage churches across the UK to run an online course for somebody in their geographical area. I know that online you can join anything from anywhere, but we're actually going to try and get people to run a course for people who are geographically located to them, so that there can be ongoing support once lockdown is over and social distancing is over. So we're trying to make that available to people. And in connection with all of that as well, we're making our training available online in shortened forms in webinars. So we have 3 webinars in June. One, bereavement care awareness, which Care for the Family is running, for anybody to understand how the do's and don'ts of getting alongside the bereaved. And that's really useful. In fact, I would say necessary for anybody who's going to be running these online courses. And then another for church leaders, bereavement friendly church. Ask for churches for leaders to explore the extent to which their church is a welcoming and accessible environment for the bereaved, and supportive environment for them. And then another one for supporting children and youth. So that's what we're putting on. And we've also got the Loss and Hope website, which was originally and is designed to support churches in their support of the bereaved. So we'll put this information on there. It's not on there yet. It's still in planning form. But we'll increasingly put information on there about how churches can get alongside the bereaved and support them. And one of the things that I'll just flag up as well here, which people might want to talk about, is that we've created what we regard as 12 marks of a bereavement friendly church. So there are 12 marks there of what a bereavement friendly church might look like to help the bereaved find that church accessible and supportive. And so that's also on the website for churches to consider.
Oh, that's really great. And well, just to let everybody know, we'll be providing links to all these different types of resources on our website once we've got the recording from today live. So you'll be able to go down and go along to the website and download that afterwards. That's really great. I mean, coming back to what you were saying there, Yvonne, I'd looked at some research recently saying that people who are bereaved actually wish that more people actually spoke to them about it, and that's, you know, maybe we're probably a little bit reluctant to bring up something that's painful for somebody. But is this correct, that actually, you know, we ought to actually be engaging in conversation and letting somebody talk about that loss?
Absolutely, that's why we've put it in this little film. Because we've had for so many decades what I would have called a death-denying society. None of us really know very much about bereavement and what it feels like. And we don't understand how important it is to actually talk about that person and talk about the loss. We think that we're going to make that create more pain for that person, but you can't make it more painful. It is as painful as it is, and desperately painful. And by talking to the person and mentioning the name of the person and asking about what happened and asking about the life with the person, how they knew them and everything, that's actually helpful. It's that elephant in the room thing. If people don't mention the name, it's as if the person's been forgotten, but they've never been forgotten by the person who's grieving, even if they're giving the impression that they have. They're always there in their mind, and they welcome somebody mentioning the person and wanting to talk about it. So there's nothing better that you can do than to dare, and we say in our little film, dare to get in touch and actually ask about the person and say, you know, how sorry you are for that person's loss.
Sharon, I want to come back to you briefly and just tell us a little bit more about the grief groups that you run and how churches can access support in setting up a grief group.
Right. At the moment, I should have mentioned before as well, we've started a Zoom meeting where people can Zoom in and talk about their loss and how they're feeling right now throughout the COVID-19, because we can't meet face to face. So we set up a Zoom where they could come on and get support that way. But for future, what we're looking at, or what we've put in place, is a living loss training for facilitators to run living loss groups around the London area. So we're looking for 12 people or more to come on the training, which we're already getting to that number, that people will be trained as facilitators, go out, run groups, and be able to assess people to attend the groups. Because when we say assess, it's really important that we allow people to grieve. Sometimes people stop people from really going through that process of grieving. It's really important that you have a period of time to grieve. So we like to assess people before they come on the group. If they're ready to attend a group after 3 to 6 months and they still need support, then you should invite them to come along. There should always be like 2 facilitators running these groups and between 6 to 10 people attending the group. So we're hoping that we would get this training off the ground in September and have facilitators around the London area running living loss groups that people could come and share what they're going through, get support from other people within the group that has gone through bereavement or gone through any type of loss. There is a program that we have set while running these groups, that the program will run through to 6 to 10 sessions. And hopefully, through the 8 years that we've been running, it's been successful, where people have been able to move forward and understand what grief is and how to cope with it when they go through any triggers in their lives.
That's great. Thank you for that, Sharon. We're going to come to our final poll for today, and we're interested to hear what additional help you are needing as a church right now. You're looking for, do you need more pastoral carers? Is it more training? Do you need more funding, more support from medical professionals, more referral pathways? What particular support are you looking for right now? And we're going to be coming to our Q&A session shortly. So I'm going to hand over to David in a few minutes' time. And David will be able to read through some of your questions for us. So still time, if you want to submit any questions or comments into the comments box, please feel free to do so. Great. How's it looking, David? Great. Yeah. Okay. So 65% more training required and more opportunities for referral pathways. We haven't had time. I mean, this is a massive subject and we won't have time to cover everything today. But one thing I'll do just before we go into our Q&A is talk about this. You know, we're not always the best when it comes to referrals as church, are we? I guess we've historically wanted to manage and keep pastoral issues within the congregation. But come briefly to our speakers again, just to comment on that and to talk about, because I know, Sharon, you offering basically an offer there of referring people to you. Yes. Let's briefly talk about this issue of why we don't always refer people over, or don't know when necessarily to refer people to a professional.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, either of you, if you've got thoughts on this as to what help churches need in terms of that, when we know it's right to refer to somebody else outside of the church.
If I could make a comment, I think people do find it very difficult because there's just general lack of understanding of bereavement. And if churches started with basic training of how bereavement impacts and the sorts of things that happen for people, then it becomes clearer as to at what point a referral is needed. And the bereavement care awareness that's run by Care for the Family is excellent at that. It helps people to it helps churches and individuals in churches to provide the friendship support that most people actually need. So there's a difference between sort of, in a sense, normal bereavement and expected. There are different types of bereavement, and someone dying elderly who's expected doesn't always, is less likely to have great impact. But people who die suddenly in tragic circumstances and all that kind of thing have greater impact. So understanding these kinds of things, a little bit of training to understand these kind of things, can help you to realise and identify the ones that are going to need the extra support and the specialists, and also help you to be the friend that gets alongside those who can process their grief and come through it healthily without specialist support. So again, the bereavement journey course that we've been developing is designed for that friendship support, and a lot of people can process their grief by going through that course with somebody who's not a professional sitting alongside them with basic understanding. And then out of it, those who have got complicated grief will begin to realise that there are issues, there are places in which they're stuck and they need some help, and then they can go to the counsellors and the professionals for the particular help that they have identified and the need that they've identified, which again takes some of the pressure off the specialists.
Yeah, no, very good.
If I could add,
please, yes.
If I can add also agreeing with Yvonne. What I find is that with a lot of pastoral cares that have crossed my pathway, oftentimes we tend to spiritualize things a lot, and sometimes when people are coming with their grief, it's not always spiritual, but it's a lot of emotion, and sometimes it can become a mental health situation whereby some pastoral kids are not always equipped to manage that, and it could become very overwhelming for them. So that's where someone that is experiencing in grief or bereavement or living loss could able to assist and support that person. So yeah,
absolutely, yeah. No, really helpful. Thank you very much. David, I'm going to come to you. I wonder if we could open up with some questions for our speakers, and if there's any comments or feedback that are useful, then let's hear them, please.
Certainly. It's been a very busy session with regard to questions. So Christina Spivey would like Yvonne to explain unprocessed grief and its impact.
Thank you, Christina. Unprocessed grief is really somebody who hasn't actually unpacked the implications of the loss for them. So when somebody important dies to somebody, then there are a huge number of areas in which it impacts somebody's life. It can be practical, emotional, spiritual, physical, all sorts of things. And people need to process all of that impact. And that's what grieving is. That's what the grief journey is. It's working out and personally taking on board and adjusting to the fact that this person has gone. And if somebody hasn't been facilitated in going through that grief journey, then what they can often do is think that they've dealt with it because they've actually sort of put a lid on it. A lot of people will get on with life, make themselves busy, keep going with things, and not allow the pain to surface, and they bury it. And it sits there, and it's often said that death is never buried alive. Death is buried alive; it's never buried dead. So you can bury it, but it will always come up and resurface. And one of the problems, or the big problem with all of this, with this unprocessed grief that we have in society, because we haven't acknowledged how important it is to facilitate people through their grief journey, the big problem is that it has negative outcomes. A lot of it is mental health issues that can arise, but there, as Sharon was saying, behavioural issues, relationship issues, addictions, all sorts of things arise because people haven't processed their loss, and can cause all sorts of manner of problems for them later. And one of the things that is being identified has been identified in recent years is the impact upon mental health. But there are many other issues that can arise when grief is not processed.
Okay, we've got a few comments here. Mike Booker wants to know, what about multiple bereavements? And someone answered this question, interestingly. What he was talking about was things like Grenfell, plane crashes, that sort of thing. Mike Freeman then responded by talking about response pastors, who were often available at multiple events where lots of people die. I know they were at Shoreham in Sussex, and they were at Grenfell Tower, and also they've been present at terrorist attacks. So response pastors get some mention there. Would you like to add anything to that, either speaker?
Again, I can say something unless Sharon would like to say.
You could go, Yvonne.
Okay. I think this is another example of why it's so important the churches gets better in their understanding of the impact of bereavement and the way that people as individuals naturally respond. Cast your mind back to when Princess Diana died, and we become so post-Christian as a society that we suddenly were surprised when everyone started leaving flowers and teddy bears and everything at Kensington Palace. That was the thing that sort of rather shocked us as a church, because we realized then that actually there's something about human beings that wants to have ritual and wants to symbolize and express grief in certain ways. And when there's a national tragedy or a lot of people dying or whatever, we want to come together, we want to remember, we want to express things. And the church has, is an obvious place to facilitate all of that, to allow people to express their emotions in the ways that come naturally to them.
Okay. Christine Thompson mentions there is an expected, this is a sociological phenomenon, I presume, an expected rise in suicides as people try to process this in various ways. What advice can the speakers give about bereavement by suicide?
Again, I can say something but I'd prefer Sharon to come in if she's got something.
Yeah, it's interesting that topic has come up because there is a lot of people, once they become quite isolated, it can be quite concerning because the thoughts are really playing on their minds, and one feel quite trapped in it, and it's really important to be able to get hold of that person, to able to talk with that person, talk through their suicidal thoughts, to help them through it, to get over it. Really, it's quite a difficult one, and oftentimes it's difficult for the churches to comprehend. And but it's something that needs attention and needs support for that individual.
Yes, can I add to that?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Suicide is a huge problem in our society. It's a rising, it's an escalating problem. Part of that is because of unprocessed grief and loss. Not all of it, and there are lots of reasons why, but part of it is because of unprocessed grief and loss. And then one of the things that we know is that suicide very often leads to suicide. That's one thing. But also this thing about lockdown, and I was interested in talking to some of the suicide bereavement charities to hear that they had observed that suicide has actually gone down over the last few weeks. We all expected it to go up, but it's gone down. And there's something, there's research out there that shows that when there are national times of real crisis, like war and that kind of thing, suicide actually goes down at first, because we've got this adrenaline rush that's going through us, and there's this sort of I must survive that's going on. But the problem is that the research has shown that it's usually followed by a tsunami. So we can expect that when we come out of lockdown to experience a lot of mental health issues and potential suicide. And we absolutely need to be prepared for that. And there are lots of suicide charities out there who are ready to help. but we as a church need to be aware that this is what we're going to face. And the other thing is to do with bereavement is that a large number of people who have a high impact bereavement do actually get to the point of thinking that life is not worth living at the time when their pain is at its worst. Doesn't mean to say they're going to end their lives, but there's often a lot of talk about that. And again, training is so important, just to understand and be able to make the distinction. Is this because they are just feeling like life is so hopeless, or are they actually thinking that they're going to take their own life?
I guess this comes back to our discussion about the importance of knowing when to refer, isn't it? And you know, when somebody is in that state, that it's really important to get some outside professional help for people and not try to manage things yourself.
Yeah.
I kind of think that this is an opportunity for society to change the way it deals with bereavement and death. Do we still have time for more questions? They're pouring in here.
Let's just a couple more questions and then we'll finish, David.
Okay, fine. Victoria Lawrence makes the interesting point. Do men engage less in bereavement than women?
Say that again.
Do men engage less in bereavement than women? Are they, I guess?
Oh,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why we set up our peer support group for men, only for men, because any bereavement activity that's run will be primarily women who turn up. It's changing, and we have the princes and Rio Ferdinand and people like that to thank, and Simon Thomas to thank for being honest about how painful and how difficult bereavement can be, and so, you know, men are beginning to open up more and show that, you know, that it's actually courageous and brave to say that I'm struggling.
Victoria,
can I just add?
Sorry, go on.
What we're finding, as Yvonne said, that men are gradually coming through, because we've been running our groups and we've been getting a few men attending the groups. So, you know, it's gradually coming.
And we need the church to again lead the way in this. Guys in the church, if you've been bereaved, we need you to stand up and say, it was awful. You know, I found this problem, I had this problem, I had that problem, and I couldn't cope, or whatever it might be, and just set the example so that other men will be given permission to also acknowledge how difficult it is.
Victoria then follows on by saying they've got a support group of men in their church who've been bereaved, which is really good. A final question I do want to ask, because this is a very slightly left field question, but one I think the church has a very important role to play in, and that is, what about helping people to prepare for their own death?
Absolutely. We've been working with the life events team of the Church of England. That's one of the partners of our coalition, Loss and Hope, where Sandra Miller there has been heading up work to try to encourage the Church of England to talk more about death in advance. And she's got this grief chat program that, you know, people can do within churches, little cards that they can do just to get that conversation going. But it actually, if churches can help people to talk more and prepare more for death, that it actually alleviates some of the bereavement issues. It's the suddenness and the unpreparedness that can actually cause a lot of the problems. So it can really make bereavement so much easier. And then, I talk in my training with churches about the need for preparing for a good death. And it would be good for churches to consider, what does a good death look like? You know, all the goodbyes and the healthy saying goodbye, and, you know, where it's possible to do so, and so on, because it can make certain things so much easier.
Yeah. Right, back over to you, Nick.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for today's for the conversation today. I know there's a lot more questions out there. What we will do is, if we'll take your questions, we'll pass those on to our speakers, and we'll get responses for you written up and provided back. And you're always welcome, of course. You can contact both Sharon and Yvonne. We'll provide contact links in the resources afterwards. So before we close, I would share a kind of, I guess, a personal positive story. Is that, well, I guess a positive and a negative story is that I lost my father when I was 11 years old. And for me, I'd become a Christian and was part of a local church. And I found that, you know, church and faith for me was just a lifeline. You know, I had families around me that treated me so well and so loving. And the church really has got so much to give and so much to offer. And it really was, for me, I say, a real lifeline to have that, you know, church at its best, being family at its best, and really loving and caring for people. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that with you. Before we do close, I'd love to hear your feedback on what you thought of today's webinar. We have our final poll up, David. Just a few seconds of your time, please, just to let us know how useful it's been. It helps us in terms of shaping what we do going forward. We will be looking at, and you may have seen this if you were watching the slides when you came into the meeting, next week we're going to be looking at engaging with disadvantaged young people through COVID-19. We have guest speakers Nathan and Sabrina Dennis from First Class Legacy and Vivian Royal from TLG joining us. Other topics we have lined up for coming weeks are supporting families in isolation and promoting healthy living during lockdown. And if you'd like to see other subjects covered, we'd love to hear from you. You can drop me an email. My email address is nickamos@cinnamonnetwork.co.uk. We want to keep our conversation relevant, and so we really need your feedback to keep us informed. As I said earlier, our webinar today will be recorded. It's being recorded, and it will be made available on the website later today, along with those resources that we mentioned. Do feel free to share that with family, friends, and colleagues. And just remains for me to thank our speakers for their time, and thank you for being here, and look forward to hopefully seeing you again soon. So thank you and goodbye.